It is an incredible story and it's incredibly well told.
He gets recruited by an NKVD agent called Leonid Itingon, who may or may not have been having an affair with his mother. And that's how he gets drawn into the plot to try and assassinate Trotsky. This man that had once commanded whole armies is reduced to pottering around in a house, pretending that he still has some sort of sway in the world.
Welcome to the History Book Buffs. I'm one of your two regular hosts, Antonia Senior. The other one is the brilliant writer and historian, Roger Morehouse. This is our brand new series where we're going to be interviewing the best authors out there about their history books, fact and fiction. And we're absolutely delighted to be kicking off with the brilliant Josh Ireland, whose book, The Death of Trotsky, we both completely adore. It's an absolute masterclass in narrative history. So do buy the book, give Roger and I a follow, subscribe on audio, wherever you get your podcasts, or on YouTube, and stay tuned to listen to me talk to Josh Ireland about the incredible story of the assassination of Leon Trotsky. Josh, thank you so much for coming on the History Book Buffs.
I'm so pleased to be joining you.
You are our very first interviewee.
That's really exciting.
I know, we're very excited because normally we review other people's books, but we don't have them with us just in case, it all goes horribly wrong. But in this case, we thought we'd have you on. Now, Josh, before we start, I need to tell you something. It's a confession. I actually pitched the idea for this book to my agent, The Death of Trotsky, the exact same title. And then I discovered you were writing it. So obviously I had to back away very quickly. But the second part of the confession is then I read Death of Trotsky and I was very miserable to discover I think you did it much better than I could possibly have dreamt of.
That's incredibly generous. But I'm sorry to have got in the way of your plans.
I know.
Yeah. But I think it's probably because it took me so long to do it. If I'd been quicker, you might have been saved that pain.
It is an incredible story and it's incredibly well told. You tell it almost novelistically. It's a kind of very narrative, very breathless, very exciting story that you tell. Can you just sort of lay out for those who haven't read the book or don't know the story at all, just the kind of, the basics, the kind of thumbnail version of this story?
Well, so I think you basically start with the Russian Revolution in 1917, which eventually brings the Bolsheviks to power. The Bolsheviks are this tiny revolutionary sect who no one before 1917 would have expected them by the end of that year to sort of be in charge of this empire of millions of people. But they're millenarian. They're communist, but they're kind of like millenarian Christians. They're obsessed. They've got this absolute excited passion for the new world that they're convinced that they're about to bring about. But unlike Christians who are sort of obviously quite invested in peace and forgiveness, what the Bolsheviks really like is ruthlessness. It's, they basically understood that the only way to achieve what they want is through blood. And two of the leading figures in this revolution are reasonably young men from the edges of what the old Russian Empire. One's a man called Leon Trotsky, who's the son of illiterate Jewish farmers in what's now Ukraine. And the other's Joseph Stalin, who's again from a really humble background. I think his dad was an alcoholic bootmaker and he's from Georgia. And they've come together and they're both ambitious, they're both clever, they're both absolutely willing to do whatever the revolution needs to preserve it, but they're also very different. Trotsky's kind of a cosmopolitan. He wears smart clothes. He has beautiful hair. He speaks many languages. He can talk. He can pontificate about Freudian theory. He hangs out in Vienna and London and Madrid and places like that. Whereas Stalin's this much more sort of saturnine, quiet, calculating figure. Trotsky sees him as like a sort of coarse provincial peasant, and sort of Stalin basically sees Trotsky as a ponce. But the other aspect of this is that the revolution is led by a man called Lenin, who goes on to lead what becomes the Soviet Union. Lenin's a man of incredibly sort of adamantine personality. He's more ruthless than anyone, incredible political strategist, but he's physically quite weak. In 1918, he's the victim of a failed assassination attempt, and his health is sort of slipping away. So both of them know that at some point one of them is likely to succeed Lenin as leader of the Soviet Union. And ultimately, it's Stalin. And like, it's one of those things where in history books and textbooks when I was a kid, it was sort of presented as this sort of competition between the two of them, as if there was ever only ever going to, as if it was it's possible that maybe one or maybe the other would have won. But actually, Stalin's such an incredibly talented politician in the sort of 20th century sense of the word, that he crushes Trotsky and sends him into exile ultimately. But his problem is that the second he sends Trotsky into exile, he regrets not having killed him. So he spends the next decade or so trying to arrange his murder. And during this decade, Trotsky is in exile, and he goes first from Turkey to France to Norway and eventually Mexico, because basically no Western government wants to keep him. You know, he's one of the most famous figures from their revolution, which horrified the whole of Europe. You know, that everyone is terrified that letting Trotsky in is a bit like sort of inviting a virus into your home. You know, if he comes to your country, then suddenly all the institutions will collapse. So that's how he ends up in Mexico. Well, the other reason he ends up in Mexico is Diego Rivera, who's the great Mexican painter of that first half of the century, who's married to Frida Kahlo, who's much more famous now. He is integral in inviting Trotsky because he's a political sympathizer. So Trotsky ends up in Mexico. And then while all of this is happening, you know, the rest of Europe is in its own kind of chaos, and notably Spain, which in the late 30s is embroiled in this terrible, vicious civil war, which drags families from across the country in many terrible ways. And one of the families that get drawn in are the sort of minor aristocratic family from Barcelona called the Mercaders. Specifically, for the purposes of the story, two of them, the mother, Caridad, and her son, Ramon. And Caridad is this extraordinary figure who basically, about 10 years before the Civil War, the family's fortunes collapsed. And so she sort of suffered the indignity of actually having to go and work. And in the course of this became radicalized, ended up as both a communist and a heroin addict, and dragged basically all of her kids into the same sort of world that she existed in. The marriage falls apart. And Ramon is just as passionate about and fanatic about world revolution as she is. And the two, mother and son, have, a deep affinity. There's a moment much later in the story where Ramon is being subject to this incredibly intense psychological evaluation, and he's asked to describe himself. And the ways in which he describes himself match identically his mother. There is something there that is difficult to explain. And his mother is this extraordinary, charismatic, forceful figure. There's a moment when she's younger and she's walking down the street with one of her sons, and the son turns to her and says, Mum, why does everyone look at you? And she says, because people always look at me. Like, there's something about, she's tall, she's elegant, she's forceful, and she's not beautiful, but she's very handsome. And Ramon looks very similar. He's tall, he dresses beautifully, he's handsome, he's clever, he's strong, he can speak different languages, he's a great storyteller. Like, all the things that you want in a spy, he can do them. You know, he's a fabulist, and he's also animated by the same passion that drives people like Trotsky and Stalin. So one thing leads to another, and he gets recruited by an NKVD agent called Leonid Eitingon, who may or may not have been having an affair with his mother. And that's how he gets drawn into the plot to try and assassinate Trotsky.
Josh, there's so much to unpick here. It's such a fascinating story. So one of the things that you do so beautifully is these kind of character sketches of each of all the people that are involved in this. They come really vibrantly off the page. So Trotsky himself, like, you describe him as sort of being a guy who's never quite stopped being a clever schoolboy, I think you say. He's desperate to show other people how much he's learned. He is super clever, but he's not necessarily the world's most kind of emotionally intuitive person, is he? He kind of alienates people. He just assumes he will be worshipped for his intellectual precocity, even though sometimes he rubs people up the wrong way. Do you think is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think that's fair. There's a person who had been a sort of friend and a loyal follower who wrote a memoir in the 30s. And at some point in the memoir, he sort of stops and he almost sort of surprises himself by saying, I realized that Trotsky, in the 20 years I knew him, never asked me a single question about myself. You know, Trotsky's incredibly self-involved. And that's kind of, that's why the contest between Stalin and Trotsky isn't really a contest at all, because I think Trotsky has this a very classical sense of how you achieve and maintain power, which is which is by being a sort of charismatic leader who stands up, delivers wonderful speeches, and everyone goes hooray, and then follows you. Whereas Stalin had a more sort of 20th century understanding of power, which is, you build up patiently power through committee, through being in control of bureaucracies, being the person who can appoint one person to a particular position. One of the things that people say about Stalin is like he's this ruthless psychopath who has millions of people's deaths on his. I was going to say it was conscience, but that's a moot point. But like he is responsible for the death of millions of people. But he was an incredibly adept people person when he needed to be. He remembered people's birthdays. Like he bought people thoughtful gifts. He knew how to work people in a way that Trotsky. It wasn't that he didn't know how; he just wasn't interested. I don't think he realized it was something that was necessary to do.
It's so fascinating, that difference between them. And I suppose one of the things that Trotsky does so brilliantly is one of the ways that you get to be a sort of, a shining star in the communist firmament is by mastering its kind of dialogues, right? Because especially in this period, it's the intellectual basis of it is like a kind of very abstruse theology that you have to know how to speak, you have to know how to kind of intellectualize. And that's what Trotsky is brilliant at, much better than Stalin. But as you say, when it comes to actually cementing, using relationships and stuff, he can't do it.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is that one of the problems that Trotsky and the thing that Stalin does incredibly cleverly after Lenin dies is that he presents himself as the protector of Lenin's legacy. And I think it's telling that the thing that Stalin was training to do before he became a revolutionary was to become a priest. And in fact, he becomes the sort of high priest of Leninism, and he's not adding anything new. He's basically saying, I will protect this great experiment in exactly the form that Lenin intended. Whereas Trotsky can't resist sort of riffing and saying his own things and coming up with fantastic new ideas. And Stalin's very good at saying, well, look, this person's a dangerous, he's a loose cannon. He's dangerous. He's going to undermine everything that we've built. All these people have died for this, so we've got to keep going. But yeah.
In terms of that, though, I mean, the other thing that I think comes out of your book very strongly, and this is something that I kind of bang the drum for quite a lot, is an appreciation of the fact that it wasn't Stalin who invented terror, and it wasn't Stalin who invented bloodshed as being a necessary kind of corollary of revolution. I mean, it was embedded from the start. Lenin and Trotsky were no strangers to this idea that, valuing life was a kind of bourgeois sentiment and that revolutions demand blood and sacrifice.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Trotsky was intimately involved in the creation of the apparatus that, the irony is that the apparatus that killed him, he helped build. He was there at the beginning with Dzyensky and Lenin creating the Cheka, which was the sort of first incarnation of what would become it had various different forms, but, it is the Soviet secret services, secret police. So yeah, it's just hardwired into the system. And part of it is, I think they, for one reason or another, were slightly intoxicated by the glamour of being ruthless, of swishing around Russia in a long leather coat, ordering executions, but also because it just are the facts on the ground that, they are this handful of men who have a very, very strong idea of how the world should be run, but they've basically started a revolution in the wrong country. The classic Marxist thought basically has different phases, and one of them is that the revolution will be conducted by a sort of enlightened working class. And like Russia in 1917 was many things, but it wasn't a country that had a large enlightened working class. It was like a peasant nation, 95% of it were peasants or something like that. So there was no sense in which this was a country that wanted specifically what the Bolsheviks were offering. So they had to force them to take it, basically.
And in the early period when the revolution was not a done deal, when things were still very up in the air, it really was Trotsky who actually managed to, cement control. I mean, without Trotsky, things would have looked different.
Yeah, I think so. I think he probably is integral to the revolution itself. I think he was an incredible revolutionary organizer. But I think once the revolution they had effected their coup and were in the Kremlin, there was this enormous counter-revolution there was this vicious, brutal. I mean, one of the most brutal wars of the 20th century, and it's people being boiled alive and sort of burned and skinned and this vicious stuff. And for a while, it looked as if all the forces ranged against the Bolsheviks, supported in a fairly lukewarm way by Western powers, notably, I mean, Churchill was sort of obsessed about trying to stamp out the revolution. But Trotsky, this man who'd never served in combat, had no military experience, he was put in charge of the Red Army, the Bolsheviks' army, and through a sort of force of will, passion, a willingness to shoot any soldier that took a single step back, but also inspirational leadership. I think he was this is where his charisma, his ability to stand up and sort of set fire to people's souls really had a value. And also the kind of classic Russian indifference to human life. So yeah, I think he protected that. He helped secure the future of the revolution during that war.
Then I guess, so once the revolution's a bit more secure, Lenin dies, and then, as you said, we kind of often look at that period of Stalin taking control as as an inevitability because he's Stalin. But actually, at the time, it did not look like an inevitability at all, partly because Trotsky seemed like the obvious heir, the obvious charismatic leader of men. So, as you said, it was very clever maneuvering by Stalin. Could you just unpick that a little bit? So how, briefly, how did Stalin maneuver to leave poor old Trotsky in the cold?
Well, I mean, it's sort of several things. So one is that even before Lenin's death, he'd been kind of quietly accumulating power. And I think precisely because he was this figure that Trotsky sort of denigrated quite famously as a grey blur. He was the person that basically people gave boring jobs to because they didn't want to do it. But when you're the person that gets to do all those boring jobs, you're the person that suddenly understands exactly how all the levers of government work, who is responsible for what. So there's that. So he was doing that. He already had this big sort of bureaucratic machinery behind him. And I think the other thing is, Stalin and Trotsky might have been the sort of the two most obvious successors for Lenin, but there were lots of other figures like Bukharin and Zinoviev, all these figures who also had a sense that they might want to have a say in how the country was run in the decades to follow. What Trotsky never did was to make any attempt to build alliances, to kind of create Trotskyists within the Politburo. Whereas Stalin was very clever at playing on people's anxieties about Trotsky. He created alliances with other figures. He continually undermined Trotsky's ability to do anything within government. And then there were other sort of things which are more about Trotsky's own, a kind of odd, it's not quite a weakness or a flaw, but it's an inexplicable element of Trotsky's personality where sometimes just when things seemed in his grasp, he would become ill or take to his bed or disappear for a while. Or, just when he needed to rouse himself to really fight for something. This person who had kind of won an entire war almost single-handedly just didn't seem to have lost his sort of moral fiber. So the sort of famous example of that is Lenin's death. So for quite a long time, people believed that so when Lenin died, Trotsky was in the Caucasus recovering from a sort of, not a significant illness, but he was away, for some R&R really. And when he died, the story most people were told throughout most of the 20th century was that Stalin was sort of so cunning that he actually told Trotsky the wrong date for Lenin's funeral, so he missed it. But actually, it seems as if Trotsky was told the correct date, but just didn't see it was important to attend Lenin's funeral.
Wow.
And so that's a sort of, there's this odd inability to sense what's important and to react to events. And whereas Stalin is incredibly good at taking events and then manipulating them for his own purposes. And, so as time goes, week follows week, month follows month, Trotsky finds himself more and more marginalized, that once this figure whose photo was hanging with Lenin in rooms across the country will enter a room and find that his portrait has been taken down. All these sort of minor but very significant symbols of the way in which power is slipping away from him. No.
Well, and then there comes the point where, as you alluded to, Stalin eventually forces Trotsky out. Why doesn't he kill him then? Why does he? Well,
I think
thinks is
one interesting thing about the relationship between Trotsky and Stalin is Stalin's feelings about Trotsky are a really good index or indicator for how secure he feels his hold on power is. So you'd have thought that obviously the time to have killed Trotsky was while he was still in the Soviet Union, but during the mid to late 20s, Stalin wasn't the figure that he became in the decades that followed. He was, the preeminent figure in Russia, but he still knew that his own hold on power was contingent on the support of others. He wasn't in charge of a totalitarian state with absolute control where everyone was afraid of him. He knew there were still other people that held their own aspirations to sort of seize the position he occupied. And he knew, because this is what he'd spent his entire life doing, weighing power, weighing how much he had, weighing how much other people had. And he had a good sense of how much power he had. And at the time, even though he'd spent 10 years sort of relentlessly attacking Trotsky's reputation and had done severe damage to it, Trotsky is still the person that had won the civil war for Russia. For the Red Army, he was still one of the leading figures from the 1917 revolution. So I don't think he ever felt quite confident he could move against him at such an early stage. And so it's only later, as his hold on power becomes tighter and tighter, that he feels confident enough to actually, really move from just suggesting that Trotsky is a sort of black sheep to beginning to paint him as being the biggest living threat to the Soviet Union and basically in the universe.
I mean, that I find it's one of the most fascinating things, isn't it? So you talked earlier about the Western powers thinking of Trotsky as being kind of a virus. You let him in and that's the end. But he's like a mind virus for Stalin too, right?
Yeah.
He lives, as the kids say these days, rent-free in Stalin's mind, relentlessly. And it's kind of one of those weird kind of Stalinist things where it's both paranoia and reality kind of tumbling together, and they're quite difficult to unlink. But he does... I think it's Stephen Kotkin, who's Stalin's biographer, says that Trotsky sort of has an outsized place in all of Stalin's kind of, waking hours. He becomes sort of...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a weird... So it's a way in which Trotsky is sort of a useful way of illuminating or trying to illuminate what is going on in Stalin's head. Because he's quite sort of... He's not a man who, if he doesn't have to speak, won't speak. But he's not someone who sort of splurges his thoughts out onto the page, but it's clear that Trotsky activates two parts of his brain. The paranoid, strange, someone described him as being sickly suspicious. This person that, won't sleep in the same bed 2 nights in a row, who looks people in the eye to see if they're, every morning he'll look his guards in the eye to see if any of them have got any sort of seed of desire to kill him. He doesn't trust anyone. He doesn't trust his own wives. And at the same time, Trotsky is the sort of embodiment of all of this. He's kind of like a bogeyman for Stalin. He dreams about him. He thinks about him while he's awake. He thinks about him as he drifts off. He's terrified of what Trotsky might do, because I think if you're creating a totalitarian state in which there's only one sort of reality allowed to the people who live within it, if someone elsewhere in the world is presenting them with a different reality, that's frightening to you. But at the same time, he very cleverly and very methodically and very, he sort of utilized Trotsky as well. So the terror is a product both of Stalin's own paranoia, but also his understanding that the best way to achieve complete control over the Soviet Union was to make every single human being within it terrified, as frightened as he was. So as the 30s draw on, he unleashes this a massive assault on the elite in Russia, on lots of the old Bolsheviks, on huge swathes of the army. He sort of decimates his secret police, and all of it is, on one hand, is part of this paranoia. He thinks he genuinely thinks they are plotting with Trotsky against him, but also it's a Machiavellian move where he understands that in doing this, in creating this bogeyman, he can persuade the rest of the country that there is a genuine threat, and thus justify his purges of anyone who could ever stand up to him or contradict him or undermine his power. So it's a very, as you say, it's very hard to pick apart one thing from the other. They're sort of intertwined. And on the one hand, he can be incredibly lucid about the way he thinks about Trotsky. And on the other hand, there is a sort of insanity about the way that this person who he's marginalized, who has no followers, who is thousands of miles away in a compound in Mexico, still represents in some weird way a threat to one of the most powerful men in the world.
You have a lovely line where you say this was the problem with Trotskyists. Like the witches who'd played early modern Europe, they were somehow everywhere and nowhere. I loved that.
Thanks,
Yeah, this sense of like, you know, you don't even have to be specific about what a Trotskyist is. It's such a sort of broad catch-all. It can apply to anybody who isn't, you know, firmly in your cause.
Yeah.
What's it even mean by the 30s? It's meaningless.
Yeah, but it's a kind of meaningless, but also highly efficient if you use it, if you're willing to use it for what you want to do. You know,
they use it as well, don't they? This is going to be a really good segue. Bear with me, Josh. They use it as well to clean up anti-Soviet elements in the Spanish Civil War, like the kind of Trotskyist purges are exactly what they use in Barcelona and elsewhere to get rid of people. Now, which brings us to Spain and the other main protagonists in your story who are completely fascinating. I want to talk a little bit about Caridad, the mother of the kind of the two. So I mean, her early life was very brutalized, wasn't it? It was horrible. I mean, some of the things she went through.
Yeah, I think. I mean, so on the one hand, you know, she comes from a very privileged background, and I think everything's looks set fair for her to have an unremarkable sort of bourgeois aristocratic life. You know, it looked as if she would spend her life, you know, riding horses, going to parties, sort of a frivolous, not meaningless, but, you know, would become a bearer of children. But even then, even during the sort of comfortable times, the family's comfortable times, I think there were always these signs that there was something else roiling within her, a kind of frustration at the sort of fate that convention had ordered for her. You know, she was always falling off horses. You know, she persuaded people to take her up in planes. You know, there was this kind of a kind of desire to be close to danger and excitement, which, you know, living in a sort of prosperous Barcelona suburb didn't offer her. But then the family's fortunes collapsed. I think the brother who ran the family's business spent all the money and ran away to Argentina. So suddenly everything was very different. But I think also there was obviously something very odd and sick within the marriage. It's difficult at this remove to be entirely sure what happened, but there is going to be these horrible stories about the Mercader, Mr. Mercader, the father of the family, forcing Caridad to go to brothels to watch people having sex in an attempt to awake her sexual appetite, which feels like an odd way of
I'm guessing
using someone. No one recommends that in on dating sites, but and then when the marriage sort of becomes even more troubled, and she begins to sort of hang out with anarchists, and there's an incredible story that she basically sort of tips anarchists off about where her brother, who's a sort of leading judge, is, and they almost bomb him to death. So this sort of absolutely terrifies the family, along with her drug addiction. So she's sent to a convent, basically, you know, written off as being insane, sent to a convent, where I think, you know, there is a, you know, you can tell a feminist story of Caridad's story about Caridad, which is that she is subject to all of the 20th century's own sort of neuroses about men and women, and attempts to sort of control women's freedom and sexuality and ability to make their own choices. And eventually she explodes all that by leaving her husband and moving to France, where she has a mental breakdown. I mean, unsurprisingly, given everything she's been through. And she disappears from her children's lives briefly, and then reemerges just as the Civil War is beginning.
And then, obviously her and Ramon both end up her son, both end up, connected to Soviet intelligence. Um, through Ramon through the figure of Eitington. I never know how to say his name.
It's
You
difficult.
do it.
Leonid Eitingon. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's one of those sort of another amazing characters that sort of sachets into the book. He's this kind of, again, from one of these people who's come from the sort of outer edges of the Russian Empire to suddenly try and, who's seduced and excited and intoxicated by everything that the revolution offers, whose sort of hands are dipped in blood even before he gets to Russia, to Spain, but who is also incredibly charming, who's fun, who loves women, who loves reading, who tells good jokes, is wonderful company. But you always know, someone once said that, that even when he was smiling, you could see something in his eyes that made you really understand on some deeper level that he was capable of doing whatever he needed to do to achieve what he was sent to do.
Which he did. I mean, as you said, there was blood on his hands, but I mean, he was a pretty nasty piece of work, wasn't he?
I mean, it's so I am on some levels I can sympathize. I think it's hard. It's hard to entirely demonize every single figure within this book, because on the one hand, I think you can understand them as figures operating in a universe where there are bigger forces than them propelling people to doing strange things. And on the other hand, I think on some level, the quality and depth of their belief in what they are doing is unrecoverable now to us. It's a bit like, I guess, trying to explain why Christian martyrs willingly went to the stake. There is a depth of passion that I don't, as a sort of, milquetoast liberal in a liberal democracy, I can't access. And the even with all this blood and chaos and horror, there are people capable of forming friendships and attachments that, one of the reasons that Ramon does what he does is because of that fanatic belief in Soviet in communism. But one of the other thing is that he's friends with Leonid, that he wants to help his friend and he wants to do what his mother wants him to do. So there's this kind of there are other dynamics and more complex dynamics which make them more appealing and more human and more legible to us. And then also, because wrapped up around all of this is that they are operating within the context of the terror, that they all know that the price of failure is death, that if they don't do what they're sent to do, they will die. And if they try and escape from this task they've been given, their families will be eradicated. They're all caught in something.
Yeah, you open the book with the assassination of Rees, who is one of the Ignacy Rees, who's one of the illegals, and he publicly breaks with Stalin and kind of comes out as a Trotskyist and is summarily murdered right at the start of the book, which is a kind of, I guess, part of what you're saying now.
Yeah, sort of anticipation of that. I think that story sort of helps create help you understand the atmosphere within which these people exist. They know that they are, on one hand, incredibly powerful because they've been given all these tools by this huge operation, but on the other hand, they are powerless, and they are constantly subject to suspicion. Their motives are constantly examined. Eitingon comes from a bourgeois background, which makes him suspicious in the eyes of the NKVD, because he isn't working class, because he comes from, the exploiting classes. So he constantly has to justify himself and his existence and his freedom. So obviously, if you're doing a sort of a ledger, these people had done do unspeakable things and willing to do unspeakable things, but there was always stuff around it which if you think about it, can help you understand why they were doing what they were doing.
It's interesting, and I don't want to sort of, preempt this. I think people need to go away and read your book. But, of your two main characters, one of them remains committed to this ideology for their whole lives, and the other kind of ends up cursing the day they read any communist tracts. I mean, it's quite interesting that you could have that, like both of them have that different reaction.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I mean, I think so. There is a sort of sense about Trotsky that there is a theory that so all the time during which he was in exile, he was constantly being hunted by the Soviet, by Soviet spies, by, that his entourage was always being infiltrated by people sent by Stalin. He was constantly in danger, both from Stalinists and fascists. And basically, there were very, very few people on the planet that wanted Trotsky to sort of see out his days in peace. And I think there is a sort of theory about him that he basically sort of it was a kind of fatalistic suicide what he did, that he never took the right precautions to protect himself. It was always the other people around him that, insisted that he existed within a compound, that he searched people that came into his office, that when he went out on the street, he ducked underneath the car seats. But I think actually, I don't think that's true, because I think he always thought there might be a way back, that he'd been a fugitive before and had ended up at the center of power. Why not again? And that he was always, I don't think he ever lost his faith or his belief in the importance of what he was doing and the value of it. Right at the end of his life, he writes this quite a moving testimony, reiterating both his love for his partner and also his more overwhelming obsession with the revolution that he dedicated his life to. Whereas, yeah, to anticipate what happens later, Ramon has this kind of strange afterlife in the Soviet Union where he begins to sort of turn things over. I realized that the thing that he sacrificed his life to wasn't worth the years, the death, the blood. That love that he had for communism wasn't really requited. And there's this amazing vignette when he's in the Soviet Union. There's a guy who was an academic going to a library, and there's another man in the library every day reading everything he possibly can about Trotsky. I think this is the 60s or the 70s.
Mm.
And one day he says to the librarian, "Who is that?" And the librarian says, "Don't you know? It's Ramon Mercader." It's this sort of sense of him sort of sifting through his past to try and work out whether he could justify what he'd done to himself.
Yeah. There's a massive set piece in the book where you talk about the actual assassination, and as I say, I think it's better read than talked about. But the other bit that we haven't talked about that I would like to just briefly touch on, which I thought was completely fascinating, was Trotsky's time in Mexico with Frida Kahlo and all of this kind of sexual shenanigans and like the kind of, and how he kind of whiled away the days. I mean, I thought it was all extraordinarily colourful and fascinating, and I
Yeah, I
didn't
mean,
come away loving these people, I'll be honest, but
it's a really weird. I mean, it's kind of is an extraordinary sort of plot twist. So yeah, so the fact that Diego Rivera. So the weird thing is that in 1937, Diego Rivera is perhaps the most famous painter and maybe one of the most famous painters in the world, certainly in Mexico, whereas his wife, Frida Kahlo, is comparatively obscure. And obviously that has been completely reversed now. But Diego Rivera was this extraordinary figure. I mean, his paintings are completely amazing. They're these huge, huge murals which sort of fuse Goya with, pre-Spanish, Aztec art. It's amazing stuff. Incredible power, incredible energy. And he himself was a sort of figure of incredible power and incredible energy. He was this big frog-like man who sort of basically everything that came out of his mouth was a lie or a fantasy or a sort of exaggeration. But I mean, he must have been incredible to be around, but also terrible to be married to. I mean, this is basically a book about terrible husbands. And there isn't a single good. There's no one. There's no one here who sort of who offers a good template for marriage. And yeah, he was relentlessly unfaithful to Frida, and then it's this unfaithfulness which drives Frida towards Trotsky, who is living in her childhood home, which is called the Blue House, which is in a suburb to the south of Mexico City called Coyoacan. I might have pronounced that badly. And at some point, not long after Rivera had seduced Frida's own sister, she seduces Trotsky. And they have this sort of slightly farcical romance where they speak English to each other because nobody else could understand it. And then they're sort of sending notes to each other. And she calls him little goat beard because he's got this goatee, and the old man. And I think he basically behaves like a sort of infatuated schoolboy. You know, I think he can't, I think, so on one hand, Trotsky's incredibly austere. You know, he hates, there's a sort of story about him being the only person that was ever on time in the Russian Revolution. And one in particular, that apparently he once shot a chauffeur for being late, which I think might be apocryphal, but might also be telling about, sort of expressive of something about his personality. You know, he insisted on perfect order right through the day. He hated people swearing in front of women or telling filthy jokes in front of women. But I think he was also in possession of like a sort of abundance of sexual energy, which when you're on the run isn't something that can be sort of, you know, if you're constantly hiding, you can't really go out to bars very often and pick up women. So I think there was this kind of a mad explosion of sort of passion and of illicit passion, which horrifies when people around him find out. They're absolutely horrified because they're worried that A, they're going to get thrown out of their house, B, they might get thrown out of Mexico, and C, they might sort of damage his reputation in the eyes of his followers. They don't think this is exactly the kind of thing that the NKVD, the Soviet propaganda machine would love to find out and exploit. And also, not unrelated, is that Diego Rivera, who routinely carried a pistol, did sort of announce that he would shoot anyone that slept with his wife, or shoot any man that slept with his wife. I think he was sort of indifferent to whether she slept with women or not, which is generous of him, I guess. So, and then it kind of ends in, you know, almost as soon as it started, it ends. I think Frida tires of this sort of man who actually is much more interested, who might, you know, is interested in her, but remains just as interested in writing quite long, boring articles about sort of abstruse points. And so she sort of puts an end to it. And then Trotsky is bereft, I mean, completely, I think, heartbroken by it. And then, just as is his wife, who is a woman who, incredibly interesting and impressive woman in her own right, Natalia, who it wasn't actually, I mean, it was a kind of common law wife in that I guess this is a really good example of the way in which the priorities of revolution, the ways in which revolutionaries prioritize their life. But he'd abandoned his first wife and children in Siberia about 30 years ago, and then met Natalia, up a new family with her. And she had basically dedicated her entire existence to him, to keeping him happy, to making sure that he could exist in as sort of frictionless way as possible. And then he sort of thanked her by sleeping with their, so yeah, it's a kind of, and I think it's also illustrative of the frustrations and the boredom and the weirdness of his existence by that point. You know, they are in this kind of slightly paradisical space. You know, it's this safe home where there are animals, there's sort of, you know, beautiful tropical birds singing in the trees, and there's incredible tropical plants, and they're eating well. But they're also in a kind of prison. You know, he can't go out into the street. If he goes on an expedition into the desert to pick captives, which he liked to do, there'd have to be like a sort of troop of, they had to have a police escort. You know, so he's this man that had once commanded whole armies, is reduced to pottering around in a house, pretending that he still has some sort of sway in the world. You know, and there's this very moving thing that his wife says, that, you know, that he was sort of walking surrounded by phantoms, you know, all these people that he knew thousands of miles away in Russia, that the people that he'd once respected and loved, people that had been in the revolutionary movement with him, had either been murdered or they'd been forced by Stalin to sort of pretend to recant anything they'd ever said before, to condemn Trotsky, to turn on Trotsky. And it was heartbreaking for him. You know, whatever you think about his own moral record, there is something so pathetic about those last few years.
Josh, it's just the most incredible read, and I strongly recommend that people go out and grab it. It's very narrative. It's kind of, there's quite a lot of detail in the narrative. I want to, just before we finish, have a quick chat about sources, because it's so kind of detailed and so granular, and there's like different shifting perspectives. I wondered if you ever like kind of took leaps to kind of make the narrative flow, because it just, do you know what I mean? Like sometimes I just
but no, is the no, and I'm sort of a bit allergic to, I think if you're writing nonfiction, you shouldn't introduce anything that you can't back up.
Yeah.
and that isn't there. And I'm always a bit allergic to nonfiction accounts where they'll say, that they'll talk about their character and they'll say something like, perhaps he was wondering in his mind.
Yeah.
I think it slightly breaks the spell because it's so much your authorial intervention in that story. And also I think if a reader has any sense at all that you're adding to the story rather than using what's already there, then I think any trust you build with them might quite quickly slip away. So yeah, there's nothing there that isn't in, either in the secondary literature or in the primary sources.
Yeah.
Mm.
Because there's quite a lot. I mean, like Platov's memoirs and stuff. There's all sorts of stuff out there, isn't there? And Lewis wrote a book about it, the brother of Ramon, right? Presumably,
yeah, which is great. Yeah, I mean, obviously, with all these things, you have to be kind of hygienic about it because people have, axes to grind and stories to tell, and also, people misremember, and so you try and make sure that everything, that if someone makes a particular story, obviously you can't do that sort of New York Times thing of saying, well, I won't write this unless I can get 3 people on the record confirming that this happened, because there is no plausible way you could do that, because otherwise you would just, it would just read like a diary entry. But so I guess you have to try and work out what feels plausible to you and what matches or echoes things that you find elsewhere. But yeah, I mean, I think that there's lots of obviously incredible secondary literature on Trotsky, and I couldn't ever pretend to be an expert because I don't speak Russian. I haven't sort of sat in all those amazing archives in Harvard going through it. But the thing that Ramon's story hasn't really appeared in any meaningful way in any English account. And I know there is amazing stuff in Mexico. One of the great things about so I went to Mexico to do a research trip, and then one of the amazing things is their archive is in the prison, or is now in the prison that had once housed Ramon. So
really,
he spent 20 years of his life, and is an incredible prison on this about to go to Mexico now holds their archives, and the archives are great for him because they have all of his trial records. And they interview the police interview all the protagonists who are still alive in the hours and days after the event, the murder. So you get a quite immediate response from these people. And obviously some of them, Ramon, so the thing we haven't said is that basically throughout, as soon as he enters the sort of Trotsky story, he doesn't do it as Ramon Mercader. He poses as a Belgian playboy called Jacques Monard, and seduces as quite a kind of naive American Trotskyist called Sylvia Agaloff, and that's his way into Trotsky's circle. And infiltrates it through her. So they never know him as Ramon Mercader. They don't even know he can speak Spanish. They think he's just this Belgian businessman. Eventually, as all dodgy people do, he's in import and export. Inexplicably. So he murders Trotsky and then holds on to this story right away through the 20 years he's in prison. He never admits to being who he is. He never admits to having any connection to the NKVD. He just says, that I was briefly infatuated by Trotsky and then I turned against him because he was such a terrible threat to world revolution. So when he's interviewed by the police, he's basically sticking to the story, but everyone else are telling you what they're still shaken. They're still sort of giving you these very vivid details. And there's Natalia trying to make sense of how she let this man into her house. Sylvia just completely distraught by discovering that she's been used in a very ruthless, brutal way to kill the person that she admires most in the world. It's heartbreaking. Unless you're in the school of thought which suggests that she actually was in it right from the beginning. There's slightly mad socialist websites that have conducted quite lengthy and on the sort of surface, they've got a logical coherence proving, why Sylvia was actually in on it from the beginning. The FBI thought she might have been. So the FBI sort of took quite a sort of deep interest in her. But then she's arrested and then set free and then goes and sort of lives as a obscure primary school teacher for the rest of her life. occasionally being visited by the FBI, who sort of say, "What are you up to?"
It's just such an incredible story. It just gives and gives. I think the moral at the end, though, is never trust a Belgian playboy.
or you'd say, never let your mother persuade you to murder a historical figure.
That's true.
There's quite a lot. I mean, I obviously didn't set out to write anything with lessons, until I kind of ambitious of those. But yeah, I think, stay away from Belgian playboys.
Don't murder revolutionaries. Brilliant. Well, on that note, Josh, that's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for talking to me. And go buy the book, people.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining me, Antonia Senior, talking to the brilliant Josh Ireland. Don't forget, give the History Book Buffs a listen or a follow wherever you get your podcasts, or on YouTube, to keep getting the best chats about books, history. Thank you for listening to me, Antonia Senior, talking to the brilliant Josh Ireland about the death of Trotsky. Don't forget to give the History Book Buffs a follow wherever you get your podcasts, or on YouTube, to keep listening to all the best content about history, books, fact and fiction. And do drop us a comment. Let us know who you would like us to get on the podcast and future date. Among the people we've got lined up is the brilliant Claire Mully. So don't forget to subscribe.